Good morning. Welcome to Holston Valley Unitarian Universalist Church's YouTube page. I'm the Reverend Tiffany Anderson, the minister of this church, and my pronouns are she and her. It is too icy to go to church today, so instead we are offering an abbreviated service for online viewing. So get cozy, everyone. Today we celebrate the blessings and the trials of being an animal in possession of a prefrontal cortex. And we will explore one of the ways that our prefrontal cortex can help us live our best lives and help us build community together as well. Unitarian Universalism has often stood out from other religious traditions as having a preference for reason as well as spirituality. Unitarians largely found themselves marginalized from mainstream Christianity because they insisted on reading the scriptures with logic as well as with faith. And we were one of the first religious traditions to embrace the findings of Charles Darwin. And many Unitarians, Universalists, and Unitarian Universalists have been writers and signers of various manifestos issued by the American Humanist Association. We advocate for a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. We identify humanism as one of our 6 sources to guide us on our quest for truth and meaning. And within our pluralism, we enthusiastically hold space for skeptics as well as mystics. Today, I light a chalice for all of us with the words of our vision statement. We work together as a church to transform ourselves, our community, and our world by sharing love, pursuing justice, and seeking wonder. In a world filled with the darkness of ignorance, let us bring the light of reason. In a world filled with the darkness of despair, may we share the light of hope. In a world filled with the darkness of hate, let us shine the light of love. Today's reading comes from Peter Steinke's book, Uproar, Calm Leadership in Anxious Times. Steinke has made a career for himself by taking the 8 concepts of Bowen family systems theory and applying it to church life. And he also uses it as a tool for understanding the behavioral patterns of society at large. There is growing evidence that the emotional problems in society are similar to the emotional problems of a family, a small group, or a hospital that employs 125 people. When a system is subjected to chronic anxiety, people begin to lose contact with their principles, self-determined goals, and intellectual capacities. There is behavioral regression as well, such as blaming, demanding, and asking for instant solutions. We are in a period of societal emotional regression wherein anxiety undermines our objectivity, fake news, sets up bogus enemies, white supremacy, denies tradition, custom-made reality, imports anti-science, climate change denial, lavishes attention on the weirdest image makers, conspiracy theories, and magnifies our differences, racism, and immigration issues. On the global scene, we see societal regression in religious wars, terrorism, ethnic cleansing, mass migration, nuclear threat, disparity in accessing resources, and the revised myth of the hero warrior who will give bogus guarantees to the collective survival brain. Bowen, foreseeing crisis after crisis, mentions that societal regression only subsides when anxiety lessens. If we could gain more control over our reactions to the reactivity of others, we could begin to take constructive action based on principle and thoughtfulness. Again, that's Uproar by Peter Steinke. I know that was a pretty thick reading, but I think you're going to see it really helps me develop my thoughts here. The power of personal precepts. Before moving up here to Tennessee, I spent 2 years at my in-laws' farm in Florida. For the most part, this swampy land that was great for peanuts, cotton, and soybeans was leased out to a farming group that did large monocrop farming every year. But my mother-in-law reserved some space for a personal garden, overflowing with field peas, cucumbers, tomatoes, peppers, leafy greens, and corn. And of course, we had to have chickens. One lazy day, I was sitting in the sun-drenched yard while my kindergartner plucked clover and chased dragonflies. I was doing homework for a class, reading about contagious anxiety from the perspective of Bowen, Friedman, and Steinke, all leading family systems experts. Family systems is a field of study that asserts that we can best understand the individual, their functioning, and their struggles from seeing their roles and reactions in the emotional systems that they are taking part of, whether that be family, workplace, or church. And it turns out that chickens are a great case study for some of the key concepts I was working on. I saw a pattern of behavior in these chickens, something they tell you to look for in family systems. This handful of chickens was out in the yard pecking around, and something startled one of them. I was paying more attention to the chickens than my reading, and I didn't see what bothered her, so it must have been something really subtle. Maybe a bug offended her. Maybe the breeze wasn't just right. I don't know what triggers run-of-the-mill chicken anxiety, but for whatever the reason was, she ruffled her feathers and started squawking and ran in an anxious little burst of energy. And here's the thing. The other chickens, who were perfectly fine right up until that moment, they joined in as soon as that chicken ruffled and squawked and ran. The other chickens didn't stop and assess the situation. They just saw that one chicken was afraid and they reacted. They followed the most anxious chicken without even thinking about it. One of the foundational concepts of Bowen family system theory is that it is the group, not the individual, that is an emotional unit, and that emotions are very contagious. For simplicity's sake, they call all intense emotional reactions anxiety. According to Roberta Gilbert, anxiety is important in emotional systems. It is usually not necessary for the purpose of thinking systems to describe the coloration of the anxiety, depression, elation, anger, etc. At base, most intense emotions is simply and can be referred to as anxiety. Emotions are automatic physiological reactions. When they become conscious, they are feelings. Anxiety is automatic, and most of it is out of awareness. Anxiety travels in group, between and among individuals. It is infectious. And it turns out that this is not just the case in family units, but is also true of businesses, nonprofits, religious communities, and nations. Our reading outlined the challenges and the threats of communal living in a society where anxiety has taken over. And egotistical, self-declared hero warriors exploit that anxiety for their own personal gain. Sometimes our society at large feels like a giant group of chickens just running around triggering each other. When the amygdala part of our brain starts registering threats, it completely bypasses the prefrontal cortex part of the brain, which is all about logical problem solving. As anxiety producing as all of this is, see how contagious that stuff is? The reading really does help us identify one of the best answers for removing anxiety from the system as well. And that is to work out our precepts and our principles ahead of time before anxiety enters the system. We can do our best thinking when our prefrontal cortexes are less harried by our fight or flight responses. Leaders who are functioning from a place of knowing themselves and knowing how they want to best behave are like an immune system to an anxious group. Removing anxiety from the system as they act on principle rather than react to the emotional soup that we are all swimming in. I think any God that is listening, that grounded, calm wisdom rooted in loving kindness is also contagious. This is called self-differentiation. Recognizing that you don't have to participate in whatever emotional reaction is circulating around you, because you already know who you are and what you want, and you have already figured out what your values, principles, and precepts are that will guide you outside of whatever the anxiety du jour is in your emotional system. And I do want to explore how we form these precepts, spend a little time in our prefrontal cortex for the rest of the sermon, but first, we really do need to take a moment to acknowledge that we primates are collective animals, that these emotional processes do exist, and that we are all way more emotionally driven than we want to be. It's really tempting for each of us to see ourselves as the exception, to see those people over there as acting emotionally and us super enlightened people as acting logically, but it's just not true. In fact, I've kind of noticed that the more someone is invested in denying that they are affected by emotional processes, the more they actually are affected by these things, just wholly unaware of them. Folks are just not as logical as they think they are. Catherine Nanolag tells the story about how one time she was having a conversation with a guy on the internet, and he said, "People change their minds when you show them the facts." And she said, "Actually, that's not true," and linked to him 2 sources that proved that point, that studied that people actually don't change their minds when you show them facts. And then that guy responded to the facts that she showed him by saying, "Yeah, well, I still think it works." He literally contradicted himself in real time. So tremendous was his attachment to this myth of human objectivity. This is why one of my personal precepts is to listen humbly and be willing to learn and change my mind, because I've seen myself do this and other people do this so much. Emotions. We're going to have them. We do better with them when we shine a light on them rather than bury them. But awareness of our emotions does not mean that the amygdala should be the driving force behind the decisions that we make. Family systems theory says that in our anxiety, we can swing from one extreme where we fuse with others, feeling like the choices we make must be approved of by the important others in our lives, whether they be partners, friends, parents, or ministers. We can also swing the other extreme in our relationships, where we cut ourselves off from our community as a whole, or from targeted scapegoats that we blame our problems on. Both of these are cutoff and avoidance. And both of these emotional reactions keep us from doing our own work to release our anxiety with spiritual practices and in taking responsibility for our own decision-making processes. At our best, we make decisions with our prefrontal cortex, the problem-solving part of our brain. And the best way we can do this is to know our personal precepts before stress enters the system. I touched on this when we talked about family dynamics during the holidays last month. You decide your boundaries before you show up at the family gathering. That way you'll know what to do when your uncle says that really rude and awful thing. We've done this as a community here. Unitarian Universalism as a whole has set their precepts by identifying values and principles that can guide us. These are things we decided by a collective democratic process, cerebral cortex, rather than just following one person who has an emotional reaction to something. And whether our preference is to let justice, equity, transformation, pluralism, interdependence, generosity, and love guide us in the formation of our personal precepts, or if we want to be inspired by our 7 historic principles that are hanging up in our church, these approaches bring us to a place where we're less reactive and more likely to live the lives that we all really want to live. As a local church community, we similarly engage our prefrontal cortexes by agreeing ahead of time about our behavioral covenant. These are the ways that we've agreed that we want to build the beloved community together. Likewise, our board develops and votes on policies so that we can govern ourselves with the prefrontal cortex gift of policy governance, rather than changing our mind about everything we decide one month to the next, depending on who is in charge and how they are feeling in that moment. Covenant and policy governance can both function as immune systems for contagious anxiety at times when emotions are running high. Personal precepts or principles are great tools, but since they are tools that we create, we need to craft them with care in order for them to really work for us. Our personal precepts can be subject to the garbage in, garbage out theory of computer programming. We've seen this. People have engaged their prefrontal cortex to make decisions based on personal precepts and have used them to make some really horrible decisions in our history. Slavery, genocide, eugenics, and all sorts of bad decisions have been propped up by precepts and principles that people have formed. So it's not just that we use precepts and logic to make our decisions, but that we have to take the time to develop the right precepts first. Being willing to continue to learn about advances in psychology, sociology, and ethics, and deepening our understanding about what it means to be a human is key in doing this. A spiritual or mindful path that deepens compassion and empathy also helps with the formation of our best precepts. That's part of why we gather every week as a community. We share love, we pursue justice, and that informs the development of our precepts. And while it's really interesting to me, what can we do with these ideas as a whole? Personal precepts are probably even more important to us in our decision making as individuals, which leads me to ask, what are your personal precepts and how did you get to them? Did you inherit these ideas from others or did you work them out yourselves? Are your personal precepts shaped by one bad thing that happened one time? Or are they striving to see and understand a bigger picture? How does your unique worldview, your spirituality, and your ethical values shape your precepts? What precepts can you adopt that will help you build the world you want to live in? These are clearly intensely personal things. And in our plurality here, I can guarantee that each of us will differ in how we will develop our precepts because the things that have shaped us, the values we've adopted, will also vary. I think the important thing here, though, is that we each take the time to discern what's important to us and what is driving us before we need these precepts. Maybe this is a simple concept, a no-brainer even, but have we done it? Have we sat down with ourselves and written out a list of the precepts that we want to guide us? When each of us does this, and we approach our decision making from this angle rather than a reactive one, then we become part of the system that releases the anxiety rather than spreads it around, and give ourselves the convictions we need to do the right thing, even when there's emotional pressure to do otherwise. Our history is full of people who have found the courage to work out their personal precepts and then live by them. Ralph Waldo Emerson stopped serving communion at the Unitarian church he was the minister of because he did not believe the ritual did what it said it did, and so he stopped doing it in response to his principles around authenticity and integrity. Henry David Thoreau went to jail for not paying his taxes because of his principles around not supporting the slave trade in any way, which included not supporting our government. Theodore Parker endured almost constant threats to his safety and was disinvited to many Unitarian ministerial gatherings and conferences because his convictions about slavery would just not let him stay quiet. James Reeb, Viola Liuzzo, and countless other Unitarian Universalists participated in the civil rights movement, even at great risk to their lives, because of their belief in the inherent worth and dignity of every person. And Phoebe Stewart and a whole host of allies right here in Jonesboro went against the societal grain when they testified on behalf of John, Edward, Peg, Rhoda, and Larkin Ford in the Tennessee Supreme Court case that gave them their freedom and the land that their father willed to them, because their principles of honesty, fairness, and human freedom insisted that they stand up for these marginalized people. You can learn more about their story on the historic marker in our church parking lot once the snow has cleared. And That historic marker, too, is the result of the principled decision of this church's leadership to make sure that John, Edward, Peg, Rhoda, and Larkin were never forgotten. Even our decision to close the building today was done according to policy and the precepts that we have formed here around safety and community responsibility. And we keep making principled decisions in this community. Decisions about how we use our building, how we spend our budget, how we make the best use of our volunteers and our time, and even, maybe, how we answer calls from the nominations committee. Church family, we are more than chickens running and squawking when others do. This snowy day, let's spend some time in contemplation and really write this list down. What are your personal precepts? In the name of all that is holy, may the connections between us inspire and sustain us. May the flame of life within us and amongst us be a sacred reminder that we are all called to serve, to grow, and to love as we continue this journey of transformation. Thank you so much for your online presence with us this week. I hope I get to see you in person next week. Here's our benediction. May justice lead us to the calling of this moment. May wonder meet us right where we're at. May we discover our collaborators and our companions, and may love guide us on our journey of transformation. Blessed be. Amen. And go in peace.